Greetings, this is Greg. Messerschmitt ME 163, Part 2. We left off in Part 1 with the discussion of the wing sweep back, and I ended it with a comment about how we really only touched the tip of the iceberg in regards to sweep back. I thought we covered enough, but judging by the comment section of the previous video, apparently not. A lot of you had questions and concerns about the effect on pitch stability. That's not really 163 specific, but it's high time we talk about it on this channel anyway, so I'll cover it and explain how it applies to the 163. So here goes. Take a look at the Hellcat in the foreground. The weight of the plane essentially acts through one point, which is called the center of gravity, or CG. This is the point on which the plane could be balanced if for some reason we had to mount it on a single point jack stand. The wing is, of course, providing us lift. The actual amount of lift varies across the entire surface of the wing, but in the same way that center of gravity works for weight, the center of pressure works for lift. Thus, lift can be thought of effectively as acting through one point, which we'll call center of pressure. Feel free to pause here if you want to read the official descriptions of these terms. Here are both from the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge and the Center of Pressure from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators, the two books I'll be using. Back to our Hellcat. Let's put in an arrow that represents the center of gravity's location. It's not exact. We're covering principles here, not doing weight and balance math on a Hellcat. Now, the center of gravity is affected by fuel load, ammo load, external stores, the pilot's weight, and anything else someone might put into the plane, life raft or whatever. Once in flight, the CG moves around a bit as a result of fuel and ammo expenditure. On some aircraft, it moves also with landing gear extension and retraction, and some planes it moves more, some planes it moves less. For all aircraft, there is, of course, an acceptable range of CG locations. Now, let's add a line for center of pressure. Notice that it's aft of the CG. Just looking at it, you might see a problem right away. We know that the plane pitches around the lateral axis and that all three axes run through the center of gravity. Thus, the center of pressure will rotate the plane around the CG and, in this case, force the nose down. So, to prevent that from happening, the tail provides downforce. About 99% of all airplanes are set up this way, with the CG forward of the center of pressure and the tail producing downforce. This gives the plane a certain amount of pitch stability. There are quite a few things to note here. Oh, and we are getting to the ME 163, trust me, but it makes more sense to start with something conventional and simple in regards to this topic, and then explain how it relates to a swept-wing airplane. Now, it's just easier to explain it this way and then show you how it applies on the 163, so that's what I'm doing. First of all, notice that the wing doesn't have to support only the weight of the aircraft. It has to support the weight of the aircraft plus the tail downforce. Of course, this causes a hit to performance because the wing has to fly at a higher angle of attack for a given airspeed and G loading because it's carrying a heavier load. Drag is also increased. For the moment, let's assume the CG is fixed in flight and our Hellcat is flying along at 180 miles per hour indicated. Now we speed the plane up to 240 miles per hour indicated. Now any pilot, or even most simulator pilots, will tell you that as you speed up to 240 miles per hour, you're going to need to add a bit of nose-down trim. As a general rule in subsonic flying, with all other things equal, the faster you go in a plane, the more nose-down trim you're going to need. Why is this? Well, the main reason is that at higher speeds, the tail produces more downforce for a given angle of attack, thus forcing the nose up. So we counter that with nose-down trim. It's also worth noting that the center of pressure moves with angle of attack. It moves forward at high angles of attack and back at low angles. This has an effect on the trim needed, but it's a much smaller effect than the variations in tail downforce with speed. Now let's talk for a moment about the CG. As it moves aft, the plane will become less and less stable in pitch. As it moves forward, it will become more stable. If the CG moves too far forward, it may become difficult to bring the nose up on takeoff or during the landing flare. Plus, stall speed will be higher than normal for a given weight due to the wing having to offset with extra tail downforce. Now, if the CG moves too far aft, the plane will become unstable in pitch and difficult to control. It may also become impossible to recover if stalled or spun. Now, most World War II fighters are built so that the plane will be controllable throughout the entire allowable CG range. One exception is the P-51 Mustang, the later ones. One of the ways they got a lot of range out of the plane was to just accept a CG for takeoff with full fuel that was so far aft, the plane would basically fly like crap until fuel from the fuselage tank after the cockpit was burned up. In the P-51, it was critical to burn fuel out of that tank before combat. Of course, due to the distances involved in escort missions, this just wasn't a problem. So the main takeaway from all of this is that the center of pressure needs to be far enough aft of the CG so that you get some stability in pitch. Now, I should mention there are some exceptions to this, but not many. The YF-16 or F-16 actually has the center of pressure forward of the CG and uses tail up force. This reduces wing loading and contributes to the plane's extreme maneuverability. So, finally, on to the 163. It's set up much the same way as the other World War II fighters. The CG is forward of the center of pressure and is offset by downforce. The difference, of course, is in how the design gets the distribution of forces without a conventional tail. It's not too hard to understand. The CG is just normal. The sweepback moves the center of pressure towards the rear. That's not the only way to move it, but that's the way it's done in this case. The opposing downforce is generated by the outboard sections of the wing, which are, of course, farther back. In the previous episode, I was not 100% sure that the wings had some twist built in, but that's now confirmed. The 163 wing has negative 5.7 degrees of wing twist, also called washout. This means that the outboard sections of the wing have a much lower angle of attack than the inboard and contribute to the downforce needed. Note, the wing also has slightly more sweepback than I thought, but I was darn close, only about a degree off. Alright, this time I really am done talking about stability and sweepback. I think that's enough for now, but keep in mind there's a lot more to this if you want to dig deeper on that subject. No discussion of the 163 would be complete without talking about Heinrich. She was one of the most famous pilots in Germany. She set many records in gliders, both before and after the war. If it involved flying an airplane, helicopter, or glider, she was often the first woman to do it and held many records outright, not just women-only records. Had she not been an outspoken advocate of the National Socialist Party, there would probably be movies made about her exploits. I understand there is a recent book about her and another famous female test pilot who was Malita Von Stauffenberg. Yes, that Von Stauffenberg. At the time of the 163's test flights, not only was Heinrich a well-known test pilot, she was a test pilot that had experience with both gliders and rocket power. In fact, and this is a bit counterintuitive, but she had experience with both on the same plane as the Germans tried adding rocket engines to the Messerschmitt 321 glider to help the tow planes get the beast into the air, and she was a test pilot on that project. She made a total of 5 flights in the 163A. On that 5th flight, after takeoff, the wheeled dolly would not release, and the plane suffered electrical system failures affecting various instruments and rendering the radio useless. The tow pilot eventually realized she wasn't going to release the tow cable at the normal altitude because she wanted to go up higher. She was towed up to about 9,000 feet, around 2,750 meters, at which point she released the tow cable, then attempted to dislodge the dolly via hard maneuvering with high levels of positive and negative G's, but this was not successful. At this point, she could have bailed out, but wanted to save the plane. Without flaps, she had to slip the plane, and this was probably the first time anyone slipped the 163 with the dolly attached. This resulted in a loss of control, and she crashed and suffered very severe injuries. After 5 months in the hospital, she went back to the test field wanting to fly the 163B, which had started testing regularly while she was in the hospital. However, and much to her dismay, she was very unhappy about this, she wasn't allowed to fly it because she was simply too valuable to the Reich for use in propaganda, and they were not going to risk her again in this airplane. According to Mano Ziegler, when she left, she said she was going to talk to Goering and try and get this decision overruled. I have no idea if she did, or if so, what Goering said, but I do know she never flew the 163 again. She did, however, keep flying, and literally flew the last plane out of Berlin just before it fell to the Soviets. Her post-war story is also amazing, but outside the context of this video, so I'll move on. Let's talk about rocket power. A rocket engine has many of the same advantages of a jet engine. There are no propeller tip speeds to be concerned about, no P-factor or other asymmetrical thrust issues from a single engine, and its thrust and power vary with speed in the same way as a jet. These are all huge advantages over piston engines. As compared to a jet, the rocket has a further advantage in that its thrust does not decrease with altitude. In a typical jet engine, as the aircraft climbs, power available decreases because there's less air to use for combustion. Note, many modern airliners get around this issue via flat rating, meaning if they need 65,000 pounds of thrust, the designers put on an engine capable of generating, say, 80,000 and, quote, flat rate it, unquote, meaning they just limit it to 65,000 pounds at lower altitude. That way you can maintain that level of power up to some higher altitude. However, in terms of actual maximum possible thrust from a given jet engine, power decreases with altitude and with temperature. Since a rocket engine isn't dependent on air from the atmosphere, altitude and temperature have no adverse effects on thrust. Thus, at high altitudes in a rocket plane like a 163, the airplane's climb rate doesn't decrease as it climbs, and the plane can accelerate to its Mach limit at essentially any altitude. There are, of course, many downsides. The first is fuel consumption. Rocket engines go through fuel very quickly, and the 163 is no exception. There were various improvements and variations over time, but operational 163s would burn through their fuel load in about 8 minutes. Now, let's go over the 163 from stem to stern. We can immediately recognize this as a B model because of its cannon ports and 90mm armored glass protection. The B model's canopy is hinged on the right side, unlike the previous A model. So if the canopy is open, that's an easy giveaway that you're looking at a B model. If it's open and hinged to the right, that is. Now, the mini propeller at the front drives an electrical generator. Behind the nose cone, you would find that generator, plus the plane's very small battery. It's about the size of a modern motorcycle battery, and it only had enough power to last a few minutes, hence the need for the generator. The nose cone incorporates 15mm armor, that's pretty thick, in more or less the location where you see the yellow paint here. The jettisonable landing gear dolly was unsprung. This is very different from the earlier 163A, which used a more complex dolly with a mini independent suspension for each wheel. Some sources say that each airplane had its own dolly and that they could not be interchanged. That seems unlikely, but it's possible. In the B model, shock absorption is provided entirely by the retractable skid. Now, if that skid was not extended properly, or if the oleo strut used for shock absorption failed, pilot injury could and usually did result, sometimes a broken back, so this was pretty serious. This could happen not only due to mechanical failure, but from the pilot failing to return the skid control lever to neutral after extension. Moving to the side, at position 1 we have the canopy. It's hinged on the right side and it can be jettisoned. However, at least one report says that the air pressure around the canopy could prevent it from departing the plane while in flight at certain speeds. In other words, you could jettison it, but it would just more or less stay in place. Behind the pilot at position 2 we have more armor. The upper portion from the shoulder height up is 13 millimeters and below 8 millimeters. Of course, enemy fire from the rear would have to go through a lot more stuff to reach that 8 millimeter plate, which is probably why it's thinner than the upper section. Overall, the cockpit of the plane is well armored, although at close ranges, US 50 caliber rounds will go right through that 13 millimeter plate, and at least on one occasion that happened, killing the pilot with a bullet through the back of his head. Ironically, we know that because his 163 managed to land itself and not blow up. At least that's the official version. I have to wonder if the truth is that the pilot landed it, but the P-51 that was attacking strafed him as he was touching down. That actually seems more likely to me, but who knows? All kinds of crazy stuff happens in war, so maybe the plane did land itself and not blow up. 163 pilots wore a special smock, which was supposed to protect them from the T-Stoff. Smock isn't the best word to describe the garment. They were really overalls, but in actual practice, they didn't work. At position 3, we have the pitot tube. This provides ram air pressure for the airspeed indicator. Typically, when a pitot tube is this long, it's because they couldn't get an accurate reading closer to the airframe. I'm not sure if that was the case here, but it's pretty unusual to see a pitot tube that long. Nothing wrong with it, I'm just saying it's not typical. Under the skin at position 4, we have the T-Stoff tank. Let's remember that there are two more of those on either side of the pilot in the cockpit of this airplane, since this one's a B model. At position 5, we have the 30mm cannon, one on each side. Some of the very early B models had 20mm cannons. I don't think any of those saw combat. The 30mm cannons packed a heavy punch, but were only accurate at close range. The plane carries 60 rounds per gun. The ammunition is stored above the T-Stoff tank at position 6 and fed to the guns by chutes that run down the outside of the tank, more or less conforming to its shape. In each wing at position 7 we have the C-Stoff tanks at 8, the trim flaps, 9, the elevons, 10, the leading edge slot, which is fixed, 11, the wing skid, and at 12, the tail wheel, which is retractable, steerable, and has its own little oleo cylinder for shock absorption. The rest of the airframe, pretty standard stuff. The rocket engine takes up most of the space between the T-Stoff tank and the tail. The vertical stabilizer and rudder are conventional. The wings are made of wood, which is not an ideal material for a high-speed airplane, but it worked well enough and had the advantages of being abundant in supply and in equipment and people who could work with it. Very important during wartime. I should mention that the rocket in the B model allows for some pilot control of thrust. The earlier models, the rocket was just on or off, but in the B model it has 4 levels of thrust controllable by the pilot. There are several variants of the engine, but most sources put the B model types from 3,500 to 3,750 pounds of thrust. That's about 1,588 to 1,700 kilograms, quite a bit. In terms of performance, the numbers for this plane are all over the place. Top speed numbers range from 590 to 640 miles per hour, with the higher end of that scale being entirely believable. That's about 950 to 1,030 kph. Likewise, published climb rates are all over the place for this airplane. Now, it is pretty well established, it's very consistent in literature, that it could go from a standing start to 33,000 feet in 2.5 minutes, but what the actual best rate was is not clear. I've seen numbers from 16,000 feet a minute to 30,000 feet per minute. I think 20,000 is believable, especially at the higher altitudes. Now, for the reasons described in my 262 video, the best rate of climb speed is incredibly high, usually listed at 420 miles per hour or 675 kph. Some sources have it much higher, up around 500 miles an hour. In short, performance numbers are hard to pin down for this airplane. There just wasn't a lot of data collected on it. But it doesn't really matter that much. Regardless of the numbers you use, performance was not its problem, as it was far superior in this regard to anything else in the sky. That's not to say the plane didn't have other problems. We know that it did. In addition to the extreme danger of the plane, caused mostly by the fuel,
it was also a logistical nightmare to launch and recover. For example, let's talk about fueling the plane. First, the entire plane has to be washed down by running water on it and through most of it. Notice in this picture, water is actually coming out the tailpipe. Everything fuel touched was purged with water, tank lines, rocket engine, everything. After that, that's probably the point where the armorers serviced the guns, although I don't have a source for that. Next, the Seestoff crew comes over in their Seestoff truck. The Seestoff crew handles only Seestoff, nothing else. Now, which tank do you think this fine young man is filling? Well, it's the Seestoff tanks. Although those tanks are in the wings, the fill point is below an access panel on the top of the fuselage, about a foot from the T-Stoff filling location. Once the Seestoff tanks are filled, everything that Seestoff could have come in contact with is washed off with water. That means clothing, funnel, the aircraft itself, the ground, everything. Because you don't want a few drops of T-Stoff and then the next guy comes along and spills a few drops of T-Stoff onto the Seestoff, and, well, you get it. So when this is done, the Seestoff truck leaves, and once it's some distance away, the T-Stoff crew shows up with their truck. As with Seestoff, T-Stoff has its own crew. They keep the water running and spraying on the ground during the entire fueling process to reduce the risk of explosion. Now imagine doing this in the winter. Ice and water trying to freeze to things would be a hugely uncomfortable and difficult. So now that the plane is fueled, we need to get it to the runway. Can't get there on its own, so it has to be towed. All this takes a lot of time. Now after the plane flies and comes back, it can't get off the runway. Again, it needs to be towed. And remember, it doesn't have wheels. So the towing process involves first lifting the plane. Once clear of the runway, it needs to be flushed with water again before anything else can be done with it, and the whole process starts all over. If the enemy is bombing or strafing the field, it becomes pretty hopeless. I should add, they had various ways of towing the 163, and some of them were pretty clever. One of them actually lifted the wing up via airbags that would fit underneath each wing. Anyhow, this complexity is in very stark contrast to, say, an FW-190, which can be turned around very quickly. You put in fuel, oil, rearm it, and assuming it's undamaged, it's ready to go. Far less chance of getting caught on the ground by enemy fighters in that type of aircraft. Now in combat, the 163 had very limited success. This man here, Siegfried Schubert, was the first to score a kill in the 163. He shot down 3 Allied bombers, which makes him the leading 163 pilot in terms of aircraft shot down. However, on a later flight, his engine failed on takeoff, and his 163 exploded in the resulting crash, killing him instantly. Combat records for the plane are vague, although it's thought that they shot down 16 Allied planes. Allied records can only positively confirm 9 of those. As with everything in war, air-to-air combat numbers, kill numbers, are murky, so who knows. 163 losses in combat were between 6 and 9 airplanes. At least 1 was shot down by a P-47. 1 was probably shot down by defensive fire from a bomber formation, and the others by P-51s. Once out of fuel, you might think the 163s would become extremely vulnerable, but initially they were still okay because of their incredible dive speed and maneuverability. They could avoid Allied fighters during their descent. However, they have to slow down and land eventually, and the Allied fighters know exactly where they're going because they know where the airfields are. So this made them easy prey once they started slowing down to land. Now, the German idea was to have other planes at low altitude to protect them, 109s, 190s, whatever. But by this point of the war, that just wasn't realistic. They were low on pilots, they were low on fuel and everything else. So what they did is they ringed the airfields, the 163's airfields, with anti-aircraft fire. And that helped to an extent, but the Allied fighters figured out how to get around that. They would simply stick close to the slow-moving 163s, knowing that the anti-aircraft fire then couldn't shoot for fear of hitting their own airplane. And once the 163 did land,
it was very vulnerable to strafing or bombing, as it had to sit on the runway for quite a while until a tug showed up, lifted it up, and hauled it off. Near the very end of the war, 163 operations ceased, and the pilots went to fly Messerschmitt 262s. I need to talk a bit more about the cannons. The 163B models, with the exception of a few early planes, were all equipped with dual 30mm Mark 108 cannons. This weapon was designed specifically to shoot down heavy bombers. It was powerful and it could bring down a 4-engine bomber, typically with just 4 or 5 hits, as opposed to, say, a 20mm cannon, which would typically need 20 or 25 hits to do the job. Its rate of fire was about 650 rounds per minute, which is a little bit on the low side compared to other cannons of the time, but not bad at all. The big drawback, though, was the gun's short barrel and low muzzle velocity. Now, there are practical reasons why it's made that way. It's not because the Germans were stupid or didn't know how to do it, and if this was a gun channel, I would probably go into all that. But what we need to know is that it's not accurate at long range, and the low muzzle velocity of the rounds means that the shells drop off quite a bit with range. With only 60 rounds per gun and a very short window of opportunity to aim them, it was difficult to hit with them in a fast-moving 163. A good pilot could do it, but it wasn't easy. Then again, there wasn't much choice. The Germans didn't have another gun ready to go that would fit in the 163 and be capable of destroying a B-17 in a single pass. Enter Dr. Heinrich Lange. This is the guy who created the Panzerfaust. He'd been working on a revolutionary weapon system for aircraft, and it would work in the 163. He used the space in the relatively thick wing roots to mount vertically firing 50mm high-speed projectiles. There are no pictures of this system that I can find, but we know roughly how it worked, and we have this picture of a similar system in a FW-190. When the 163 flew underneath the bomber, light-sensitive cells would detect the bomber's silhouette and fire the shells. It didn't need to fly into the bomber's shadow. The system would detect the difference between the bomber's silhouette and the background sky. There were 10 shells in total, 5 in each wing. Some sources say 8 total, like everything else with this airplane. Stuff is all over the map. Now, all would fire at about the same time and shoot out in a narrow fan pattern to increase the odds of a hit. And a single hit was enough to bring down any aircraft in the world at the time. As it turned out, firing all of them at the exact same time would be a disaster. They learned that earlier when testing the system on the 190. So the 163 system had a slight delay between the firing of the 10 rounds. Although on one occasion when all 10 did fire off at the same time, it resulted in a destroyed 163, although the pilot lived. I'm amazed that this system worked, I really am, but it did. It was too little too late, but in testing it hit targets with a very high degree of reliability. 2 different types of targets, 2 different types of testing. It seems that only 2 airplanes were equipped with the weapon, although some sources say 6. And in actual combat, it brought down 1 Allied bomber, but that was about a month before the end of the war and right before they ended 163 operations. So the system never really had a chance to show what it could do in combat. One 163 was armed with R4M rockets, just like the one seen on this 262 here. Never went into combat with them. So, was all this worth it? I see this question posed a lot of times. And from an objective standpoint, with the benefit of clear 2020 hindsight, no, it wasn't. The 163 project was very costly in terms of lives and resources, caused more damage and loss of life to the Germans than to the Allies. But perhaps a better question, and a more realistic one, is, was it a good bet knowing what the Germans knew in 1940? That's a much harder question to answer. Everybody loves to play Monday morning quarterback for the losing team, but that's child's play. Now, they deployed these airplanes around high-value targets, much as surface-to-air missile systems are deployed today. Originally, they planned to have a long line of them north to south all across Germany.
That never really happened. They'd never got enough of them, let alone enough pilots. So they went with this other system of deploying them around high-value targets, a pretty reasonable idea. And had the plane been safer and deployed early enough in the war so they could be protected by 109s or 190s when they're landing, then I could see sufficient numbers of these planes making a difference. Would they have been better off with 163s or with more 262s instead? Probably the 262s, but they didn't know that in 1940. Plus, they couldn't build that many 262s anyway due to material shortages. It is interesting to note the similarity of the 163 with later surface-to-air missile systems. They're both deployed in a similar fashion, being set up in a ring around high-value targets. The difference being that instead of a guidance system and a warhead, the 163 uses a pilot and cannons, but in operational principle, they're actually somewhat similar. Someone in the comments section of the previous video also pointed that out. There's a lot of good information, by the way, in the comments section on this channel. Just something I wanted to mention. Anyhow, as a matter of fact, after the war, the Soviets acquired some Me-263s. 263s. That was the 163's intended successor. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, they built their own version of the 263, and that was called the MiG I-270. This MiG was canceled and replaced with surface-to-air missiles. So clearly the two have similar intended purposes. Let's look at some of the planes which were related to the 163. First, have a look at the 263. It only flew in glider form, but was pretty interesting. Now, the early rocket engines, the early rocket fighters, the DFS-194 and Me-163A, which developed out of it, have rocket engines that were simply on-off, no thrust control. The 163, as I mentioned earlier, has thrust control, but only 4 levers of power. Now, it didn't work that well. It was hoped, well, it worked well in terms of controlling the power, but it was hoped that this would extend the plane's endurance, but it had minimal effect. Reducing thrust did not reduce fuel consumption by a significant margin. It did, however, allow the pilot to slow the plane down, so that was great. The solution was to use a newer dual-chamber rocket engine. You can see the dual outlets in the images at the rear of the 163C. It's a prototype. It was never operational. Now, the new dual-chamber engine allowed the plane to cruise on the lower chamber, thus conserving fuel when maximum thrust wasn't needed. So the ultimate evolution here was the 263. It was built, but it only flew in glider form. With the dual-chamber rocket, it had an endurance of 12 minutes. And that's a 50% improvement over the 163, but more significantly, because of all the fuel burned in climb, it had a lot more left over at the top of climb, and its time in combat from top of climb until it had to start its glide back down doubled. So going from 8 to 12 minutes was actually very meaningful. Now, I've read speculation that its burn time could have been extended to 20 minutes had they got it into production. And that actually makes sense to me, just looking at the plane, figuring out where they could have put more fuel and such. Now, more importantly, or well, at least very importantly, especially to the pilot, it now has retractable landing gear. That makes it far safer than the 163. There are no solid performance numbers for this airplane, but it appears it would have been about the same or better than a 163B. So think of it as a 163 that's much safer and has more endurance. Now, you might think our story would end there, but I'm going to drag this out a bit more for the sake of completeness. When the war ended, the U.S. started rounding up all the top German scientists and engineers and sending them to the U.S. I'm sure you've heard about this. It was called Operation Paperclip. When they found Alexander Lippisch, he'd been working on his P-13A. This is a mock-up of it in this picture. This was a coal-powered, yes, coal-powered ramjet interceptor with tremendous speed capability, or at least that was the intent. It was planned to go over 1,000 miles per hour or 1,600 kph with stability way in excess of Mach 2. And that was apparently verified later in some wind tunnel testing in the U.S. The P-13A was based on the DM-1 glider. The U.S. forced Lippisch and his team to finish the glider variant before sending it and Lippisch to the U.S. That glider still exists, but you can't see it. It's buried in the Smithsonian, probably near that TA-152 you can't see. During the post-war era, Convair, that's the company that was formed by the merger of Consolidated and Vultee. You know Consolidated, they built the B-24 Liberator. And they were quite interested in Lippisch's work. They used a lot of his data to build the XF-92. This is an early mock-up of it, and it was based very heavily on Lippisch's P-13A. It eventually turned into this airplane, which then led to the F-106 Delta Dart. And that's not a stretch either. The lineage from the P-13A to the F-106 is directly traceable. The F-106 is interesting. It's one of the forgotten airplanes of the Cold War, at least it seems to be mostly forgotten. It first flew in 1956 and became operational in 1959. It could reach Mach 2.3, some sources say 2.4, which was very fast in 59. What's perhaps more significant from a design standpoint is that it achieved this speed with only 24,500 pounds of thrust. I could not find a single Cold War airplane that was faster on less thrust. All the pilot reports I've read say that the 106 was highly maneuverable and an excellent dogfighter. However, it never saw combat, and in Vietnam the F-4 was used instead for two main reasons. First, the F-4 was a multi-role plane. It could carry bombs. Second, the 106's missiles were not that great. The 106 was sort of a victim of its time. It came out a little bit too early to be able to take advantage of the better missiles, and a little bit too late to see action in earlier conflicts. As far as missiles it carried one, and get this, air-to-air unguided rocket with a nuclear warhead. Obviously, that's not useful for targeting MiG-17s over Vietnam. You don't want to irradiate a whole country just to knock down a few MiG-17s. So in addition to the nuclear air-to-air rocket, it carried Falcon Missiles. This was the first true air-to-air guided missile the U.S. Air Force had, and it just wasn't that good and really only useful against bombers, meaning big airplanes that aren't moving that fast and not maneuvering very much. And the plane carried, the 106 that is, had an internal missile bay, so it couldn't be easily converted to carry different weapons. Thus, the F-4's ability to multi-role and carry the newer missiles, Sparrows and Sidewinders, prevented the 106s from engaging in anything in Vietnam. Now you can see shades of Lippisch's designs today in many aircraft. French Mirages, the Space Shuttle, oh those aren't flying anymore, B-2 and others. Speaking of the B-2, here's a fun fact you won't find on another channel. This plane flies 30-hour missions, sometimes longer. It has a two-man crew, no lavatory, and no rest facilities. Those two pilots up there are heavily medicated, granted by a aviation specialized doctor, but nevertheless heavily medicated so they can stay awake, and they're up there wearing adult diapers for their mission. That's all for this episode. Have a great day.